So, you guys, I very obviously did not put on this trad wife getup for nothing. We have got to talk about this. And more importantly, we've really got to talk about this. So, let's cut straight to the chase. Why do some women ally themselves to politics which seem to be in direct opposition to their interests as women? And why don't we ever talk about it? Well, we're gonna have to be honest with ourselves here. We don't talk about it because I think we have a collective tendency to overlook the fact that a lot of American women have played key roles in regressive political movements throughout history. I think this overlooking is probably motivated by two things. One, a kind of covert sexism, where we assume that the few positive qualities which women are expected to embody in patriarchy, like empathy and sensitivity, make them incapable of direct involvement in politics, which, fall on the wrong side of history, so to speak. And two, a frankly cringe, intersection-blind belief that all women experience patriarchy equally as a net negative, or at least an obliviousness to the privilege given to women who occupy spaces in proximity to powerful men. However, we're thankfully all completely woke intersectional feminists who've listened to all of the Angela Davis, and we're not going to let ourselves fall into those traps today, god damn it. Speaking of intersections, I do think that's how we should be centering our discussion around why trends like this happen. So with all of that out of the way, let's start by looking at two of the biggest intersectional draws for American women to the right: race and class. Part 1. Race. So obviously race is going to be a major factor pulling white women specifically to the right, and history has shown us that gender interests are not often enough to trump, no pun intended, privilege afforded due to race. A lot of white women have actually played key roles in championing movements against progressive policy, like affirmative action and integration.
Jim Knight with WALB Television News. We're soliciting the views of many people on the Civil Rights Bill. Would you like to give us your views?
Well, I think if they remain peaceful, it would be a lot better than perhaps the violence that was a concern. Well, of course, being a Southerner, I'm not for it at all.
I see.
Historian Stephanie Jones Rogers writes in her book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, that lots of white women actually directly owned slaves in their own right, meaning they had a direct economic incentive to maintain the institution of slavery. Usually it's been assumed that sexist legal barriers to female ownership, like coverture, meant that white women couldn't be slave owners. And there's some truth to this. Some women were prevented from owning property, and thus were prevented from being slave owners. But a lot of white women found ways around this, be they through legal means or otherwise. One example Jones Rogers gives explains that young children, particularly infants, were considered liabilities at slave auctions, and therefore were often just left there while their parents were taken. These slave-owning men's wives then took in the infants who were left at the auctions and raised them as investments. And it wasn't really questioned because they were doing what women were assumed to do best: raise children. I mention this example because I think it shows how some white women have been able to exercise agency in a sexist society by weaponizing the oppression of other people, but doing so in alliance with patriarchy and other regressive institutions. By the time of Jim Crow, a lot of white women were becoming heavily involved in the conservative racial politics of their time. That is, white supremacy. This was in part because they were successfully able to elevate their restrictive caretaker positions as wives, mothers, nurses, etc. to the level of political fodder. So they were marrying the same gender roles that confined them to the whiteness that privileged them. That is, they were both racist and they were sexist. Actually, one of the most notorious examples centers around the role that white women played in propagating white supremacist policy in public schools. It was a woman who would lobby states throughout the South to adopt statewide textbook adoption committees, a Miss Mildred Lewis Rutherford, longtime member of the United Daughters of the fucking Confederacy. They come up a lot. Anyway, that same Ms. Rutherford would use the power of the UDC to lobby those textbook adoption committees and get them to only approve textbooks for southern states which downplayed slavery and glorified the Confederacy. These textbooks would go on to educate literally generations of Americans up throughout the 1960s, including these women's daughters and granddaughters. Some of these later women, working alongside other white women throughout the country, would become leaders in the movement against integration, known as massive resistance. So they put on their Sunday best and formed anti-busing protests, weaponizing tired racist dog whistles about keeping schools clean and safe for their children to soften the edge of their racism and pull other white women to their cause.
We want our kids safe. We want our children safe.
They were throwing eggs at the window and trying to hit people with them.
And there was like we was in school, there was throwing glass at black people and little kids.
What school was this again?
The Roger class.
Are you going back to school tomorrow?
No way.
Unlike the last generation of Jim Crow Janes, some of these later Southern women are still actively voting in our elections and form part of that cursed statistic we saw at the beginning of the video. So, okay, we could go deeper, but I think the record has kind of spoken here. White women have a history of involvement in right-wing politics which centers around maintaining their racial privilege. But there's another intersection at play here which draws some women to the right and which is actually heavily tied up with race itself. Part 2. Class. So what about the privilege afforded by wealth? Does that draw some women to the right? Well, yes, it's been generally true that rich, or at least upper middle class bitches, stay in the Republican Party. It's simply a fact of life. This is in part because their wealth has exempted them, to some extent, from the struggles faced by less economically privileged women, like unequal pay and lack of access to reproductive health care. Case in point, femcel activist and political legend Phyllis Schlafly dedicated the peak of her work in the 1970s to opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA was an amendment which, clutch your pearls, y'all, guaranteed people equal rights regardless of sex. I know, it's simply too radical. Anyway, had it not been for Schlafly's red-pilled ass, it probably would have been ratified too. The reason I mentioned Schlafly, though, is that her campaign to cancel the ERA centered around appealing to a certain kind of woman. And no, I don't just mean white women. No. I mean white housewives. Her rhetoric was attractive to them because it stressed maintaining their privileged economic position relative to other women. Schlafly played on fears these women had that second-wave feminism would spell doom for their roles as traditional wives and mothers in the suburbs. She convinced them, women, that the ERA was opposed to their interests as women, and it literally worked. I think many of Schlafly's supporters were kind of keenly aware of the fact that, relatively speaking, they were living kind of bougie. I mean, you guys, they didn't have to engage in wage labor, their husbands had good-paying jobs, they lived in their desired racially and economically homogeneous neighborhoods, and their children all went to elite schools. In other words, they were content. And even though they were living within the confines of a limited domestic role, they didn't seem to find the fight for equality a worthwhile investment. Of course, for other women, the lifestyle on the other side of the white picket fence was largely unattainable, and they didn't really respond to Schlafly's fear-mongering. But, like I said, Schlafly was still successful, because even though her base didn't represent most women, their voices carried the weight of their privileged status. And frankly, they had time to stop cleaning house and go out and campaign. Essentially, their class gave them both the time and the resources to protest, and the privilege to be concerned about losing in the first place. Class privilege was clearly a more pressing concern than gender equality for these women. So, taking a step back, I'm very aware that these two intersections don't account for all conservative women, especially non-white conservative women, but we do still need to talk about them. Part 3. Other appeals. Okay, this is where things get sticky, and before we dig in, I do want to emphasize that other appeals to the right still intersect a lot with class. Many non-white or queer women who do align with the right are able to do so because of their economic class, or because doing so means an elevation of their existing class by acting as bad faith political actors for money. No, that does not mean that all marginalized women who identify as conservative are grifters. It just means that, like many white women have abandoned gender interests to focus on racial privilege, some conservative women from marginalized communities have abandoned the interests of those communities in pursuit of economic gain and acceptance. It's the acceptance part that I think really makes the motivation different here. The women we talked about in previous sections had a seat at the table to begin with. Like, yes, they experienced sexism. I don't think we can deny that. But there was still a place for them as white wives and mothers. Women from minority communities who come to the right have no such space, or at least those spaces are much more limited. The political right is, however, still eager to fill said spaces with marginalized women and platform them, because they can then use these women as shields from accusations of bigotry. Yeah, I know. The political faction who says we use identity to shield ourselves from criticism, then uses identity to shield itself from criticism. Whatever. Let's be clear though, conservative marginalized women still don't get treated like the Tommy Lorenz and Lauren Southerns of the world. Their support for the right remains strong, however, as it's reinforced both economically and socially. That is, with empty notions that they're somehow more enlightened than the other women from their communities. Kind of like the Schlafly supporters, the allure of true equality isn't seen as a worthwhile investment in light of their current material circumstances. In the end though, the gag of it all is that these women are just used as tools by the right, even the white housewives. Sadly, they serve as very effective tools, and that makes the strong base of conservative women in this country all the more powerful and all the more concerning. So to finish, we do kind of need to touch on what makes all of these women so effective as vehicles for right-wing messaging. Part 4. Final thoughts. Remember in the beginning how I said I think we're less apt to talk about women's involvement in right-wing politics because I think we're less apt to conceive of women as, well, bigots? I think we also have a tendency to find hateful rhetoric more palatable when it comes from a woman, especially if that woman is occupying a non-threatening role, like wife or mother. I started to understand this a lot more fully as I was reading a book, Sisters in Hate by Sayward Darby. Based book, by the way. Buy it, read it. Anyway, Darby chronicles the lives of 3 white women who became embroiled with the alt-right in the mid-2010s. As I was reading about the lives of these women, I realized all of their messaging had a common thread. That is, they were all incredibly talented at reframing outlandish racist conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement as reasonable talking points, by tying them to domestic concerns like the safety of children. One of the white supremacist women profiled, Lana Lockteff, had this to say at a conference. A soft woman saying hard things can create repercussions throughout society. Since we aren't physically intimidating, we can get away with saying big things. This talk, of course, might ring a bell for y'all at this point. The segregationist women and Schlafly supporters were keenly aware of that same sentiment that Lockteff was echoing decades later. They veiled their bigoted beliefs in performative concern for certain kinds of homes and children. They were allowed to do this because homes and children were their concerns, the concerns of women. No matter what originally drew these women to the right, be it race, class, or something else, they serve as some of its most effective messengers. Even conservative women now continue to employ the same dog whistles and strategies to squeeze their views through the Overton window with a veneer of maternal concern. So I leave you with this. When you look at statistics like those from the beginning of the video, be aware that they don't come from nowhere. The women those numbers represent are, unfortunately, even more influential than you might think. Also, if you happen to be one of those right-wing women, don't forget about the story of Serena Joy from The Handmaid's Tale. She spent her life fighting for aggressive, conservative politics, but when those politics actually brought about a brutal patriarchy, the narrator had this to say about her life. She doesn't make speeches anymore. She has become speechless. She stays in her home, but it doesn't seem to agree with her. How furious she must be, now that she has been taken at her word.